Everyone should be able to see my screen as well, so the slides. And as Annie has introduced, I'll talk about the first steps to consumer identity access management, not in the sense of your project, but in the sense of where does your interaction with the customer or the consumer finally start. So I'll talk about verifying your customer, authenticating your customer, and I'll also look at the role of KYC for consumer identity and access management, and also look at where learning from other approaches might be beneficial to you to get better in what you do in consumer and identity access management. So this will be a little bit more high-level talk, looking at various scenarios and use cases and giving some guidance that hopefully helps you then to get a good start into the rest of the these 2 days we have at our customer CusTech event. So I want to start with some targets to look at. And the first target, from my perspective, is with everything we do around customers and consumers, it's minimizing drop-off rates. So drop-off rates in the sense of someone visits your site, someone starts doing things, and never registers. And I have to admit, I'm a person who is, I think, very good in increasing drop-off rates, because if something in this process, in the registration process, in all the other things around it, so which cookies to give consent for, etc., if something annoys me, then unless there's a super good reason that I continue my journey with an organization, I drop off. So there must be a really good reason. So the only way to get a product I really want to have, for instance, that I ignore such things, or that I say, okay, I accept them, I don't like them, but I accept them. But at the end, it's a challenge. And minimizing drop-off rates is a fundamental thing we must achieve with everything we do. And that is not only something the marketing people, the people building your digital experiences must look at. It's also something we, in the consumer identity access management space, so sometimes more the techie people, must support. So that is the first thing. The second thing is minimizing churn rates. Churn rates are, in contrast to drop-off rates, which happen at the beginning in the common definitions, and as we all know, these definitions sometimes vary a little, are the rates of people not coming back. And so the first thing is obviously related to the registration, to the onboarding process. The second target is related to how easy is it for someone to come back. And again, if I look at my daily life, most of the websites, most of the digital services I'm using still rely on username and password. So it means I have to work with secure passwords, not always using the same, which also means that I frequently don't know the password again anymore when I go back. And so this really boring old school approach of authentication is something which increases churn rates, because in several cases I again have the situation that I say, okay, it's not so important that I spend the effort for resetting passwords or other things. So at the end, this leads to lost business. And there are certain challenges behind that. The first challenge is the verification. So is that Martin who wants to order something, or who wants to sign a contract with a telco, or do something in the banking business or whatever? So it's the verification part. Is that the person claims to be? So Martin or not Martin? The second challenge is registration. So gathering some information about Martin, the one you really need. And registration is, when you look at drop-off rates, quite frequently that place where things just fail, because you then are confronted with this registration dialogue and say, okay, do I really want to go through all that? And sometimes you're also confronted with questions about some of the attributes where you say, why would they need that? So what would be the reason that they ask me for that information? And that is the second element here. The third challenge then is the authentication. That is what I touched around the churn rates already. So is authentication convenient enough to do it again and again? And honestly, as I've said, when I look at most digital experiences, then they are not really modern digital experiences, because if username password is the only choice, and it still frequently is, then digital experience in a modern sense is a very big word for that. So there must be more, there must be different things. So when we look at this, there are various ways to do that, and they also depend on the use case, on the scenarios you're working in. And so the most rigid scenario at the end of the day is where you have regulated use cases where there's where there are high requirements on the verification, and it's a very advanced use case. In that case, you start with the verification. So, and that can be sometimes annoying, even while solutions get better. But I remember maybe 2 years ago or so, I ordered a mobile phone contract online, and that really wasn't fun. The entire video identification, which required me to restart it 3 times and then to walk through a series of mails, which were, even for me as a tech-savvy person, very cryptic. So things are getting better, and I've seen over the past months a couple of really good and smart solutions. Then it's the registration, and that might be filling a lot of forms, depending on the regulations, clearly. You can have, by the way, the same experiences by walking into the branch office of your bank, and then the first thing after saying, hello, Martin, is that you get a stack of paper to sign since your last visit for all these formal things. So and yes, some things need to be done, and you can't avoid it. Then you have the authentication. So you verify, register, you authenticate. This is at least in KYC, the mandatory way. We can't do much around it. And authentication then also is about sometimes higher requirements on the level of authentication. So if you look at PSD2 in the banking and the finance space for payments, then it is something where requirements are that you have a strong authentication. So it must be good enough, it must be strong, and it anyway should be convenient. You might then have additional things like signing further documents in certain areas over time, and then you can do the transactions. And so it's a long journey from the verification to registration to the authentication to signing additional documents and finally having the transactions. There are scenarios where you need to do it, and then if you must do it, you can try to make verification simpler. You can try to simplify registration to make it more convenient, and you specifically can work on providing a better experience in authentication. And I'll touch this also in a minute again when we look at some of the other concepts. So when we look at the standard consumer journey, which is in the lower, lesser regulated use cases, then we have one thing more, which is important, which is consent. So the everything else part. But at the end, it's also frequently that it starts with some form of verification. But we always need to ask the question first, when do we really need to verify? Sometimes it is required to know a little about it for payment use cases, etc. But when do we really need a verification? We should ask ourselves this question. And we had at other events, we had some very interesting discussions and breakout sessions and others where we discussed the various ways to do these things. We have the authentication, and we not even need to register until then. So we not even need to verify maybe. At that space, we don't even need to authenticate. So people do a lot of things. And then at some point, when they really want to step into business, then we need to do some verification, maybe. But even, let's say I pay with PayPal, then My use of PayPal, in fact, is the verification of things, and my shipping address is a verification, because if I enter something which is just invalid and the parcel never arrives, then it goes back, okay, a little cost, but it's, in many cases, this is not really the showstopper for that. So I can keep it simple. And authentication, as I've said, passwords, yes, you might need them for sort of the downstream solutions for the ones who still want to stick with passwords, but think about what can you do better than passwords? What can you offer in addition to passwords? And maybe also in addition to passwords and Facebook logins, because again, that might be not enough. So think about better ways to do it. Registration at some point might happen or not. But the problem is that many people don't want to walk through this registration process. So keep it as simple as you can. And whatever, if you have the shipping address as part of what you anyway receive during the payment process, if you can then ensure that, okay, there's prepayment, the parcel ships to an address, and if it doesn't come back, then everything seems okay, then you can really simplify the process for the individual, for the customer, for the consumer, and that is where you should look at. You then manage the customer records you have in the consumer identity management. You might link them back in all these processes to some ERP systems and other things. And you also might collect information for doing marketing automation. So this is, when we look at this, there are some fundamental differences to a KYC process. So verification might happen sometimes really at some places, sometimes really indirectly. Authentication not necessarily must be super strong, but honestly, if you use good modern approaches, we can do it strong and still convenient. Registration, don't put too much emphasis on having people registering early, because this is what scares them away. It's better to say, okay, right now you found what you want to do with us, and then register. Maybe you already have for the shipping enter all the data, and it's just saying, okay, do you want to reuse it, and make it as easy as you can. And then there's a different approach again, and this is where I think it's very worth to look at when we look at the different ways, and this is the decentralized identity theme. It's about reusing and simplifying. To some extent, decentralized identity is still in its early stage, so we see a lot of evolution here. On the other hand, it's not really that new. So at KuppingerCole, probably more than 10 years ago, we talked about concepts such as what we call live management platforms. And there's a lot of similarity to what is here in the decentralized ID. Blockchain ID was a hot topic some 3, 4, 5 years ago. A lot of this led to what we see today in decentralized identities. So the idea is then to reuse the verification and registration to simplify authentication. So I have a strong verification here that is very common to decentralized identity, but it's a simple, it's a one-time thing, and it's something where the providers of these concepts really try to simplify that. So you usually do it with your smartphone in a very efficient, a very, very well thought out manner. You then also have your authentication built in, usually based on some sort of multi-factor authentication involving your smartphone, but also could be other approaches. So it clearly goes beyond username password here. And you have data you put into your ID, and then you can control which of that information is provided upon an agreement you have with another party. So it means you do that verification once, but you can use it for many. You can authenticate against a lot of providers, potentially using the same authentication. So it's not keeping tons of passwords in mind. And you do your registration thing once, and you can reuse it. Still, what we see, honestly, a lot of, or most of the BID implementations we currently see are limited to a certain bank or a group of banks or other financial institutions. So it's still not really widely used, but it potentially can be done because it's built for reusability. And your agreement decides on which data the other party, the vendor or whatever the organization can use. And still you understand as an organization, okay, this is marketing coming in. So the marketing automation part, depending on the content and all the other things for sure, still can work. So it doesn't inhibit you doing things, but it makes the life for the customer far easier. So when we talk about drop-off rates, when we talk about churn rates, then we are clearly in a better situation. And when we talk about registration, then the other thing, so if there's little KYC required, if there's not a regulatory requirement to do a verification, we also can go, and that would be, if you're not yet a decentralized identity, that would be, we say, okay, let's fill the people their card. That's what I already said. We check out, we pay, and then we say, okay, maybe you can really directly register, because if you want to come back, it will make your life easier. And if that then is easy and not again a complex step, and sometimes it is then that creating that account is really too cumbersome. If you really simplify that part, then things become easier. And then again, processing, marketing, automation is not affected. So there are different ways, and I think it's very important to step back and think about what is the right approach, or what are the combinations I can offer. So DID can work smoothly with all the other approaches. And that leads to my recommendations right now. What is my number one recommendation? It is adaptive authentication, and it's adapted to the customer in the sense of the customer can use ways for authentication which are good enough for what we need to do, but which work best for the customer, not adapted to what we just have currently in place. It's the customer that counts. It is reusable verification. So if there's an option to reuse the verification, that is, for instance, in DID, they offer certain other types of identity providers, then do it, because verification is so annoying. Even if it's done good, it's always a process. Follow the DID evolution or revolution. Look at it. Look at what it provides when it's ready, what you can do there. There are a lot of options. Offer options for the registration. Make it as easy as you can. And always think about what you really need to ask. So what is mandatory, what is optional? And I see so many scenarios where there's just an ask for too much of technology. And last but not least, think beyond passwords, because passwords are not a modern approach for a modern digital experience anymore. That's it from my end, and I'm open to questions. On the side of that, I hope we can have a lot of, or you will have a lot of interesting sessions over the course of these 2 days. Thank you.